Fox News alert now from the State Department, warning moments ago that Egypt could, quote, see real confrontation tomorrow, end quote. The escalating violence comes as the Obama administration ramps up its calls for President Hosni Mubarak to step aside.
It's my belief that an orderly transition must be meaningful, it must be peaceful, and it must begin now.
The time for a transition has come, and that time is now.
Our advice to Egypt, publicly and privately, is this can no longer wait. This has to start now.
No, now means yesterday. Because when we said now, we meant yesterday.
Joining me now, Fox News national security analyst KT McFarland, former speechwriter and courting disaster author Mark Thiessen, and Fortune magazine Washington bureau chief Nina Easton. Panel, thank you so much for being here. KT, let me start with you on that. Now you see the administration ramping up its pressure on President Mubarak to get out, and to get out now. That's what the protesters want in the street, and yet there are real questions about what that would mean for that country and ours.
Yeah, you know, Megan, what worries me so much about this is that by trying to conduct diplomacy in public, what happens is that Mubarak's going to dig his heels in. He thinks he's got no place else to go. So that by the president and everybody in the administration continuing to say he's got to go now, I mean, they should be saying that. They should be saying that privately, and they should be saying that with some real sticks attached to it. And they should be saying it to the Egyptian military, because at the end of the day, it's the Egyptian military that is either the kingmaker or the king breaker. In this case, we want them to be the king breaker.
Well, Mark, there was, they've been saying that over the past few days, those sound bites we just played. And what we saw in response was a crackdown by Mubarak on the demonstrators, which had been mostly a peaceful thing. I mean, not entirely, a lot of injuries, but the violence escalated. And some are theorizing that that was essentially, a thumbing of the nose by Mubarak at the White House.
Oh, it absolutely was. At the moment that President Obama was saying those words to him, that we want a transition and it has to begin now, it has to be peaceful, Mubarak had already ordered these government mobs to go in and start beating people and throwing Molotov cocktails and causing violence. They've now started a roundup of journalists. And the Egyptian people, we've been for weeks now sitting back and sending signals, well, we want caution and stability and reform and all this. And let me tell you what the Egyptian people's response is. This is a picture from yesterday, the protesters in Liberation Square. Obama, shame on you. They don't think the American people are with them. They don't think the administration is with them. And that is extremely dangerous, because if Mubarak falls, they will think that they did it in spite of us, not because of us. And if he survives somehow temporarily, they will blame us for being complicit in it. So we have to start standing much more clearly with the protesters in Egypt today.
Interesting. But, you ask a different person, you get a different perspective on that, Nina, because, we had Ambassador Dan Gillerman on our show yesterday, former ambassador of Israel's to the United Nations, and he was saying, don't throw Mubarak under the bus. He's been a staunch U.S. ally, and he's kept peace in the Middle East for 30 years. What message does it send to our other allies if we go all in on Mubarak and ignore these protesters?
Well, Israel is, of course, the big elephant in the room, and that's a big reason why the administration, this administration and past administrations, to be fair, have sort of defaulted to this idea of, well, stability might be better than democracy. And by the way, Condi Rice, in a very important 2005 speech, went to Cairo and challenged that notion, that stability, keeping these rulers in place, she challenged Mubarak, she challenged the Saudi Arabia regime, and she said, you know what, that doesn't necessarily lead to stability, and we're seeing that now.
Yeah.
I do think the president has to stand with the protesters. I do think Mubarak's time is limited, and there is an opposition movement. There are leaders who are meeting privately in sort of a shadow parliament that we can connect with. We have connections to the army, to whom we give about $1 billion in aid a year, which is a very pro-Western organization. We have methods of influence in there, but I do think the president, I disagree with Katie. I think the president does have to be out there and standing alongside the protesters.
But KT,
the problem that I worry about is that the longer this takes, the more discredited everybody around Mubarak becomes. And what you want to avoid is throwing the baby out with the bathwater, that if Mubarak has to leave and all the other people around him have to leave, then you have a vacuum. Then you have a power vacuum. And who thrives in a power vacuum? The Muslim Brotherhood. And so I think that he's got to go. But how do you best get him to go? I don't think you shame him in public. I think you shame him in private and make sure that he goes by the end of the week.
Well, that's the question mark, because they say the Muslim Brotherhood right now is the only group that's organized well enough to actually step in and fill that vacuum. And the Muslim Brotherhood, this is from one of their top members the other day, saying, quote, "The people should be prepared for war against Israel." Now, if that's the group, and by the way, he wants to shut down the Suez Canal, which affects oil in the United States and so on. So if this man actually speaks for the Muslim Brotherhood, a group that does not like the United States or Israel, and that's the only group that can fill the vacuum, shouldn't the administration be pushing against having Mubarak go right away?
No, absolutely not. The best way that we can lose our influence in Egypt once Mubarak falls, and it's not a question of if, it's a question of when, is for this to be the impression of the Egyptian people. If the Egyptian people think that we are against them, all of our influence once Mubarak is gone is going to be dissipated. And of course, you know, this language of caution was one thing before yesterday, but there is a full-fledged crackdown going on right now. Journalists are being arrested, people are being killed, thousands of people are being injured. How can we stand by on the sidelines?
And
we need to do what we did in the Philippines.
How can we, I want to get Nita to weigh in on that as a journalist. How can we? I mean, at some point here, you're seeing American journalists being evacuated by the truckloads now because they were attacked en masse yesterday. By
pro-Mubarak forces. I mean, going back to this question that you were talking about earlier, it is not just a question of the Muslim Brotherhood versus Mubarak. This is what Mubarak, that was the argument he used for decades to stay in power. In fact, there are other opposition leaders. They've been quashed by Mubarak for years, but they're liberal, secular people who are meeting, who are talking. There are other forces that we can talk to, and yes, the Muslim Brotherhood will probably be involved on some level in a coalition government, but you've got to move towards a coalition government. You can't just say, well, it's going to be, you can't keep Mubarak in power but just because you're afraid of the Muslim Brotherhood. Anyways, it's gone beyond that. I mean, we couldn't keep him in power if we wanted to.
Yeah, it seems like, especially tomorrow, things are going to come to a head now with this latest State Department warning. And what they're saying will be the biggest demonstrations yet on the streets of Egypt tomorrow, as we will cover that live. KT, Mark, Nina, thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.